The village of Selborne in Hampshire, overlooked by chalk hills, crowned by beeches, surrounded by fields that have been farmed since prehistory, small, pretty, but not dramatically different from a dozen others in the south of England. But a village whose name is known throughout the world and whose birds and plants are familiar to people in Sweden and Italy, the United States, Germany, and Japan. The village's fame rests entirely on one book, which takes the form of letters to two of the author's friends, in which he describes in great detail the village and the animals and plants that form so much a part of it. Not, you might think, the most sensational subject, but to judge from the number and variety of editions that the book has been through, it's one of the most enduringly popular books in the English language. And this is it, The Natural History of Selborne, by Gilbert White, published in 1789. Just to give you a flavour of it, here's a passage from the second letter, taken almost at random. There stood an oak which, though shapely and tall on the whole, bulged out into a large excrescence about the middle of the stem. On this a pair of ravens had fixed their residence for such a series of years that the oak was distinguished by the title of the Raven Tree. Many were the attempts of the neighbouring youths to get at this eyrie. The difficulty whetted their inclinations, and each was ambitious of surmounting the arduous task. But when they arrived at the swelling, it jutted out so in their way, and was so far beyond their grasp, that the most daring lads were awed, and acknowledged the undertaking to be too hazardous. So the ravens built on, nest upon nest, in perfect security, till the fatal day arrived in which the wood was to be levelled. It was the month of February, when those birds usually sit. The saw was applied to the butt, the wedges were inserted into the opening, the woods echoed to the heavy blows of the beetle or mallet. The tree nodded to its fall, but still the dam sat on. At last, when it gave way, the bird was flung from her nest, and, though her parental affection deserved a better fate, was whipped down by the twigs which brought her dead to the ground. It's easy to see why emigrants to the United States and Australia in following centuries took this book with them to remind them of home. There are no ravens to be found in Selborne today, but much of the village remains remarkably unchanged. This ancient yew tree stands in the churchyard. It was very old when Gilbert White was here. Some estimate it to be 1,000 years old. Gilbert White measured and recorded its girth, 23 feet. Today it measures 24.5 feet. The plain facts of Gilbert White's life are simply told. He was born here in the village in the vicarage, where his grandfather was vicar and his parents were visiting. The family came to live permanently here when he was 9. He went to school in Basingstoke and on to Oxford University, where he became Fellow of Oriel College. But all that time, his home and his ties were here in Selborne. And when he was 31, he came back again to be curate at this church. And he remained a curate for the rest of his life, either here or in neighbouring parishes. Indeed, he repeatedly turned down offers of promotion in order to go on living in Selborne. He never married, and when he was 69, he published his one and only book. 4 years later, he died, and he was buried in this churchyard just a few yards away from where he was born. It would be difficult to think of a less eventful life in a worldly sense. But for him, his days were packed with incident. This is the Wakes, the family home. He built this path to keep his feet dry when he came out onto the lawn, one of his main areas of investigation. Nothing was too small to escape his notice. He'd come out here at night with a candle and looking at the earthworms lying out of their burrows in copulation. They're very venerous, he observed rather tartly, and seem to engender throughout the year. And he looked at their casts and deduced from them that they ate earth, and that therefore farmers and gardeners who disliked them would find their land cold, hard-bound, void of fermentation, and therefore sterile, without earthworms. We think it proper, he added, to throw out these hints in order to set the inquisitive and discerning to work. It was 104 years before anybody was sufficiently discerning and inquisitive to set to work, and then it was no less a person than Charles Darwin, who wrote a monumental book about earthworms and paid handsome tribute to Gilbert White. White was never worried about appearing eccentric or indeed slightly dotty in his investigations. He wondered whether bees could hear, so he came to a hive like this one and shouted at them through a large speaking trumpet with such an exertion of voice, he wrote, as would have hailed a ship at a distance of a mile. And still those insects pursued their various employments undisturbed and without showing the least sign of sensibility or resentment. He had a friend who, doubtless egged on by him, listened to all the owls in the neighborhood and concluded that they all hooted in B flat. And it had to wait until the age of the tape recorder before there was anybody with sufficient inquisitiveness or discernment to follow up that fascinating subject. And having made his observations, he would come into here, his study, to note them down in his journal, which he kept meticulously every day. It's easy to imagine him sitting at his desk, with his wig on his head and a quill in his hand and his black clerical clothes. But in fact, we haven't got a real portrait of him. All we have are two rather uninformative sketches on a leaf of Pope's translation of the Iliad, which White was given as a prize by Pope himself when he was at Oxford. From the accounts of others, it seems that White was a short, rather prim little man, gentle and even-tempered. Certainly it seems impossible to imagine him ever getting angry, and the only account we've got of him even approaching irritation took place possibly in this very room. His devoted manservant, Thomas, came to him one morning and said, "Please, sir, I've been and broke a glass." "Dear me," said White, "how did you do that?" "Like this, sir," said Thomas, and he picked up another wine glass and dropped it on the floor. And all that White said was, "Go along now, Thomas, you are a great fool," adding under his breath, "and I as great a one for asking such a foolish question." But if White had been just a quaint, rather eccentric English parson of the 18th century, it's difficult to imagine that his book would have achieved such enduring popularity. Why should that be so? I suspect the reason lies in what happened not in this room here, but out there in the garden. His fellow naturalists called this little bird a willow wren, but White noticed that the willow wren had three quite different songs, and discovered as a result that there were in fact three similar-looking but quite different birds, which we now call the willow warbler, the wood warbler, and the chiff-chaff. He was also the first man to observe this little creature closely. He found it in the cornfields, where it wove its nests, wonderful procreant cradles, White called them, and he recognized that it was quite different from the house mouse, and so became the discoverer of Britain's smallest rodent, the harvest mouse. And this bird obsessed him, the swift. With that penetrating power of observation which was one of his outstanding abilities, he saw that they copulated in mid-air. "I would wish any nice observer that is startled at this supposition," he wrote, "to use his own eyes. If he would watch these birds sailing around at a great height from the ground, he would see every now and then One drop on the back of another, and both of them sink down together for many fathoms with a loud, piercing shriek. This I take to be the juncture when the business of generation is carried on. He was fascinated by swifts and their near relatives, martins and swallows, and every year he eagerly waited for their arrival in spring. One thing about swallows remained a puzzle to him to the end of his life. Did they or did they not spend the winter here in hibernation? He knew that some of them flew to Africa, but he found it very hard to believe that the young, only a few weeks old, could possibly fly all that way. And so he searched in the thatch of the cottages. He employed villagers to explore the shrubs and cavities of the wood above his house. He looked in riverbanks and sand pits, but he never found what he called the secret dormitories. Today we know that they all do make that journey back to Africa. But even the fact that he made important scientific discoveries is hardly enough to account for the immortality of his book. I suspect that its enchantment comes from the picture it gives us of a man in total harmony with his world. This is one of his favourite walks, and during the years that he took it, James Bruce, the Scot, marched into Africa to discover the source of the Blue Nile, and Captain Cook sailed across the Pacific to find extraordinary islands in the South Seas. White knew all about those important discoveries. He had met Sir Joseph Banks, who was with Cook on the first voyage, and corresponded with him. But for him, Selborne provided all the wonder and splendour and drama that he required. The deep lanes around the village he found very grotesque and wild. These rugged, gloomy scenes affright the ladies when they peep down into them from the paths above, and make timid horsemen shudder while they ride along them. But, he added, they delight the naturalist with their various botany. He was awed by the chalk hills of southern Britain. He called the South Downs those majestic mountains, and doubtless they appeared as impressive to him as the Himalayas do to our more jaded eyes. But this hill was undoubtedly his favourite. It rises from the bottom of his garden, and he built this path up it so that he could come up here to this wood, the Hanger, with its beeches. The beech he called the loveliest of all forest trees, with its smooth rind or bark, its glossy foliage, and graceful pendulous boughs. And here at the top he built a thatched alcove where he could sit and watch birds. And here too he sometimes held decorous tea parties and what he called cantaloupe feasts, at which he handed round melons from his garden. Gilbert White made no boastful claims to immortality. It took him a whole lifetime to get around to publishing his single book. But here and there, on places that he held particularly dear, he inscribed his initials. On his melon wall, on his brew house, on the addition he built to the wakes, and that was all that he asked for on his tombstone. Just 2 letters, modest, elegant, and unobtrusive, like his prose.